outside the walls of the Abbey here in the cloister on the way to the chapter house. It's one of my favourite bits of history in a building that is packed with history. This, though, is very special. This is thought to be, correct me if I'm wrong, thought to be the oldest door in Britain. It was, the wood was retrieved from the original Anglo-Saxon abbey and it was made into a door. Here it is. That means, think about it, that means this door is around about 1,000 years old, which means this wood was mature oak in 1000 AD, which means this oak could have been a sapling 500-600 years before that when the Romans left Britain. So this wood might have seen Romans marching back to the continent. Well, David, thank you very much. You've brought me to Westminster Abbey, the central religious and, well, what is the importance of the Abbey in British life?
This is the most important and the most significant church in Britain, and that's true for many reasons, but one of them is that it is this curious paradox of being a very sacred place. It is a church devoted to the daily round of worship to Almighty God, but it's also a very secular place with an unrivaled array of monuments ranging from grand royal tombs to the tomb of the unknown warrior. And it's that extraordinary combination of the sacred and the secular, and of course the fact that it's a spectacular building, which does make it one of the very greatest churches in the world, and certainly the greatest church in this country.
Right, well, let's start at the very eastern end as the sun's rising. Let's go and look at the Henry VII Chapel.
Excellent. Let's get on with it.
So this is, in many ways, my favourite part of the Abbey. It's why we started here.
Well, so here we are in the Lady Chapel, constructed in the early 16th century, the last major piece of construction before the Reformation. And in some senses, this is a very European piece of architecture. It reminds one that the Abbey, the Catholic Abbey, was part of European Catholic Christendom. But then, of course, as we can also see here, later on, as the Abbey evolves into being something very different, a national church, it then becomes the headquarters of the Order of the Bath in the 18th century, and we see the banners here now of the senior Knights of the Order of the Bath, and it's used, of course, as their chapel. We see the coats of arms of previous Knights of the Bath, and so what begins as a kind of monument to European Christianity and perhaps late Renaissance values becomes later the embodiment of national identity, and because it's the Order of the Bath, military people and civil servants.
That's very interesting. I never thought that in this space. So, but Westminster Abbey I've always thought of as being a national church, but actually that's more post-Reformation, is it?
Yes, that's a post-Reformation development. Okay. I mean, it was never, as it were, the original story of the Abbey and the history of its early centuries sees it as being part of Catholic Christendom. It was an abbey. It was also, of course, becoming a national church in that monarchs from William the Conqueror on were crowned here, but it was primarily an abbey, part of Catholic Christendom. And it's only in the Tudor period that it becomes instead this Protestant bastion of national identity, and in that sense, secular religion as well as sacred religion.
How did it survive the Reformation? Why was it not all smashed up?
Well, the story, of course, of the 16th century is very extraordinary. Henry VIII decides it's going to be a cathedral. Previously it had been an abbey presided over by an abbot. Henry converts it into a Protestant cathedral with a bishop. And for a very brief period, there was a Bishop of Westminster who was subordinate to the Bishop of London. Then, of course, soon after Edward VI, Mary comes along and puts it back to being a Catholic abbey again. And if Mary had married and had children, that may be how it would still be to this day. Mary, of course, doesn't have children, and as a consequence of that, Elizabeth succeeds, and in 1560, Elizabeth gives the abbey its royal charter. And from then on, it is, of course, Protestant, and it's also, it bears this strange title, it's a royal peculiar. There's no bishop. ever after, and the Abbey only recognises the authority of the monarch, not of the Archbishop of Canterbury, but of the monarch. Under Henry VIII and then Edward VI, it was a Protestant cathedral, but then under Mary it goes back to being a Catholic abbey. And had Mary sired a succession of children and, as it were, established her royal dynasty, then it's perfectly possible that the abbey would have remained a Catholic monastery and would not have evolved into the icon of national Protestant identity that from the time of Elizabeth onwards it has since become.
So speaking of Mary and her sister Elizabeth, I think they're buried just next door, aren't they?
Let's go and see them. They're still here.
Now, as I remember it, James VI actually shoved these two off into the side, didn't he? Because it's sort of...
Yes, he wanted to start things all over again, and establish that the Stuarts were a new dynasty, and so these earlier relics, as it were, of a previous royal time were not what he felt people should be focusing on once he'd arrived. So here we have, in a sense, the juxtaposition of these two very different monarchs with very different beliefs, and it's a reminder that religious strife is not a pretty spectacle.
There's a tradition, well, certainly in the medieval period, that all monarchs were buried here. So it must have had a primacy right through from its establishment onwards.
Well, most monarchs were buried here from Henry III to George II. Not all of them, but most of them. And so that was the period when it became a royal mausoleum across the generations. But of course, the initial establishment of a major royal connection with the Abbey was really Edward the Confessor. It was Edward who rebuilt the Abbey. That was the second building on this site. And then, of course, under Henry III, it's Edward the Confessor's tomb, which was elaborately reconstructed. And Henry III both rebuilds the Abbey and is the great proponent of the cult of Edward the Confessor.
Poor old Henry III, he's an important man, he gets left out. He's overshadowed by his terrible father and famous son.
Yes, it's a terrible injustice, really, because much of the Abbey as we see it today was his creation. He establishes the tradition that monarchs are generally buried here from his time until the early Hanoverians. He was the creator, in many senses, of the cult of Edward the Confessor. The Abbey, even today, is really more his church than any other monarch's. And yet, as you say, he's a kind of invisible presence.
So we've got Mary and Elizabeth, sisters, not great friends in life, buried together.
Not great friends in life at all, because they had embraced these different belief systems, Catholicism and Protestantism. The 16th century was the heyday of the wars of religion. People died for their faith, were burnt at the stake, not a happy time. But here they are, united in death as they never really were in life.
Well, and as James VI would have, James VI and First would have it, sort of united together in almost obscure, sort of put off to the side because the royal line that endures would flow through James I and the Stuarts.
Exactly so. So here they are, if not exactly marginal, then they certainly aren't as centrally placed in the Abbey as perhaps, especially in the case of Elizabeth, their historical fame might lead you to have expected.
Yes, sir. Not available for general. I'm not sure I've ever been allowed in here.
Well, we are not the general public.
This is right. This is very
No, at least not today. So here we are, standing in front of the elaborate tomb of and monument to Edward the Confessor. And one of the ways in which we need to think about the Abbey in medieval times, thanks again to Henry III, who is responsible for constructing this extraordinary funerary monument, is that it did become a shrine to Edward the Confessor, King Edward the Confessor, subsequently, of course, Saint Edward the Confessor. And that's one of the identities that was very strongly created in medieval times for the Abbey. And it is rather ironic that it became a place of pilgrimage, this shrine to Edward the Confessor. But nowadays, of course, there are so many pilgrims, otherwise known as visitors and tourists, that they can't be allowed in at all.
Yes, that is ironic. So why was Henry III keen to celebrate the Confessor? Is it because the Norman and Plantagenet kings of England wanted to root themselves in that Anglo-Saxon period, or was it less cynical?
Well, I think that one of the things that's often going on here in the Abbey is, as one royal dynasty succeeds another, they either want to proclaim discontinuity with the previous royal dynasty, or for different purposes at different times proclaim some degree of connection and continuity. And both of those options are in some senses on display in different parts of the Abbey with regard to different tombs.
Lovely, what a lovely thought. So this is Edward the Confessor, is inside here. Of course, we should say, Edward the Confessor, he built an original abbey here, an Anglo-Saxon abbey here, and was buried in it. And we think perhaps King Harold was actually crowned the same day that the Confessor was buried.
Well, we think King Harold was crowned here. It's not absolutely sure, but it seems as though he was. The Confessor, of course, was not crowned here. He was crowned in Winchester. If Harold was crowned here, he was the first English monarch to be crowned here. And of course we definitely know that William the Conqueror, who was French, not really English at all, he was certainly crowned here. But before that, in Anglo-Saxon times, English monarchs were not crowned here. They were crowned at the appropriately named Kingston-on-Thames. So the connection between monarchs, the Abbey, coronations, is very much something that gets going with William the Conqueror. But William the Conqueror, of course, was French, not English.
And then we've got other monarchs buried around the edge of the Confessor. That's Henry V, I think, brought back from his dysentery, the death by dysentery in a siege in France.
So this really is the heart of the Abbey as a royal mausoleum. The centrepiece being, of course, this extraordinary tomb of and monument to Edward the Confessor, but then with these other royal tombs round about. And it's worth repeating or worth remembering that beginning with Edward the Confessor, but only systematically from the time of Henry III through until George II, who died in 1760, this was the place where English and then British monarchs were buried. So it became the royal mausoleum, and that gave it an unrivaled prestige and appeal, which no other church, no other great church in this country could possibly compete with.
It's amazing. We are standing within touching distance of several tombs of, well, Anglo-Saxon, Norman and Plantagenet monarchs.
Yes, it's an extraordinary gathering of royal tombs, and there's certainly no equivalent to this anywhere else in England, and I'm not entirely sure that there is anything quite to compare or compete with this anywhere else in the world.
I always get very naughty, I always get the naughty feeling that I'd like to open up these tombs and conduct scientific research on the bones. But I mustn't say that too loudly.
I think you really mustn't say that too loudly. One recumbent effigy where you would be sure to be disappointed is at the Abbey's West End. There is a recumbent effigy of Lord Salisbury, the Prime Minister in the late 19th and early 20th century. And there he is, very much like these monarchs we're seeing here, who are also recumbent. But in Salisbury's case, there's nothing inside. Really? Because he was buried at Hatfield. And that's the last recumbent effigy that was put into the Abbey.
Rather a statement to have yourself chiselled in Westminster Abbey in a recumbent pose alongside the kings of medieval England, isn't it?
Yes, and then to be buried somewhere else. That's very stylish, I think. It's very stylish.
So you something about high
Tory politics in the late 19th and early 20th century.
So obviously we associate it with royal burials, but there's all sorts of memorials and burials to great Englishmen, Britons following that in the centuries that follow its building.
That's correct, and interestingly, as it ceases to be the place where British monarchs are buried, because they go off to Windsor after George II, it becomes ever more the place where great British non-royal figures are buried, and here we have James Wolfe, who is slain. This is in 1759 at Quebec, and this is a staggeringly grandiose 18th century monument. And this did become quite the fashion. There's a no less grandiose monument to William Pitt, Earl of Chatham.
Yes. Ligonier, here's another fellow commander in the 7 Years' War in North America. All 18th century geeks, this is our little zone here, but then what's this rather wonderful stained glass window? I don't think I've seen this.
This is not the 18th century at all. This is David Hockney. This was recently installed as a modern commission, and it's partly in celebration of the Queen, and so the motif there is mainly the countryside. It's a celebration of the Queen as somebody who often prefers to live in the country than actually to live in the town.
Verdant.
Verdant.
And then we've got Asquith up there. Oh, look, we've got prime ministers. You've taken me to the prime minister.
We have lots of prime ministers here, and over here in particular we have Gladstone.
Yeah.
That's the last life-size statue that was installed in the Abbey. And here is Disraeli, his great rival, and you will notice that they are not looking at each other, and that is not accidental. But by the late 19th and early 20th century, there was this problem that the Abbey was getting so full of statues and tombs and effigies that it was overcrowded. And one scheme was to construct an extraordinary extension to the Abbey, a kind of imperial Valhalla, where it was thought that all the heroes of empire going forward would be buried. But that never took off, although in the late 19th and early 20th century there were lots of ideas to do that. So as a result of that, what happened in the 20th century was, on the whole, far fewer burials, no more statues, and instead memorial tablets and the burial of cremated ashes. But this world, especially in the 18th and 19th century, of very grandiose, extravagant monuments, really did come to an end with the statue of Gladstone and the recumbent effigy of Lord Salisbury.
Because you've got Canning, Peel. I remember Nelson once boarded an enemy ship and shouted something like "Glorious Victory" or Westminster Abbey. And that meant to his men, we're at death or victory.
Yes, I think he also ponders that on the eve of the Battle of Trafalgar, that by tomorrow it'll either be victory or it'll be Westminster Abbey, though of course in fact it was St Paul's.
Ended up in St Paul's.
He ended up in St Paul's. But they're not what you'd call understated, these monuments. I mean, they really are extraordinary.
The ones that I like the best are the very grandiose ones of people you've never heard of anymore.
Yes. Well, I think there's a kind of inverse relationship in some cases, that the less you've heard of them, the grander the monument. But here is Gladstone and his wife. They're buried. So Gladstone is buried here and gets a great statue as well. Now, one of the reasons Queen Victoria didn't like him was because he was almost as much the emblem of 19th century Britain as she was, and she rather resented that.
Yes. So she outlived him, though, luckily.
Yes, and one of the pallbearers at Gladstone's funeral, because of course the funeral took place here, then he was buried, one of the pallbearers was her eldest son, Edward, subsequently Edward VII, and she was enraged that he had undertaken to appear to mourn the man whom she so loathed, that's to say Gladstone, and she wrote him a letter saying who had he consulted and what were the precedents, and he rather grandly replied he had consulted no one and there were no precedents.
We've got Wilberforce there.
Yes.
Canning.
Yes.
Goodness.
Yes, this is very much 19th century Valhalla.
Well, do you know, us 18th centuries like to call it the long 18th.
The longer, yes, it took over the 19th.
Yes, exactly. We chop off the first bit. So we're now standing under the crossing. This is Henry III, is it?
Well, most of this is Henry III, although it is fair to say that the roof fell in the Second World War, and so it all had to be restored. What is also Henry III is this extraordinary installation here. This is the Cosmati pavement, which is one of the greatest architectural or artistic treasures of the Abbey. And this again is a monument, in a way, to cosmopolitan Catholic Europe. And that is and it has recently been cleaned and restored, and it is a very, very extraordinary feature of the Abbey.
Right, let's go and look at the poets.
Let's go and look at the poets. So here they all are.
Yeah, they really are.
This is very good company to be in. So
Byron, Donnan Thomas,
Tennyson,
George
Eliot,
Tennyson, God.
they're all, well, they're not all here, but quite a lot of them are indeed here. Robert Browning, Ted Hughes,
Goodness me,
Philip Larkin.
The First World War poets, yeah?
Yes,
Wilfred
First World
Owen
War
and-
poets. Trollope is here. Not a poet, but it's a kind of literary
Yeah, exactly.
agglomeration. Henry James.
And now do we not put people in here anymore?
On the whole, we don't put people in. We occasionally put ashes in, but no, people don't get in on the whole anymore. It's thought to be rather crowded, and that was the decision that was taken in the early 20th century, that on the whole, after Gladstone, you wouldn't get you wouldn't get a corporeal burial here on the whole. You would either get a memorial slab or perhaps your ashes, your cremated ashes might be interred, but not many more bodies.
It's funny what the process of memorialization means, because you do think of this as sort of the greatest generation. I mean, obviously they're all from different periods, but one think that by being memorialized here, how that affects our memory of them.
I think that is right. That it's seen, perhaps rightly, perhaps wrongly, but undeniably as the final accolade that you get commemorated here, and the decision about who should be commemorated here is the Dean's and no one else's.
Oh. I know who to be nice to now.
Yes, well, he won't still be Dean when your time comes. So
Inshallah,
it's a bit premature. But that's because, again, there's no bishop, because the Dean is the person who is in charge of the Abbey and responsible to the monarch for the care of the Abbey. It's the Dean who decides who should be commemorated in this sort of way.
We've been talking a lot about burials, but the other rite that happens here traditionally has been coronation, crowning of the monarch. And we haven't seen one of those for ages, but actually I'm fascinated to watch that, because unlike royal weddings, which are far more recent developments really for the democratic age, the coronation is a ceremony that does have antecedents 1,000 years ago.
Yes, coronations have been occurring in the Abbey since 1066, and that's a fairly long tradition. I should have thought we might agree. Of course, the nature of the coronation service has changed over time. It's always been a work in progress. But I suppose for many people, even to this day, the most famous coronation is, of course, the coronation of the present Queen, partly because it was the first ever coronation to be televised. And that had an extraordinary effect at the time. And of course, Britain is just about the only country in Western Europe that still does coronations. Most monarchs in Spain, in the Netherlands, in Belgium, and in Scandinavia don't get coronations anymore.
Really? They just sneak them in by
They
the side door?
just sneak them in. Well, they haven't got anywhere as good as this, of course, to have a coronation, which might be one reason, but no, Britain is the only country that still does coronations.
I always thought we've got Isaac Newton there, who of course deserves to be. I've always thought Stanhope did rather well to get that, because I mean that's a good slot.
It's a very good slot.
And he, tragically cut short and everything, but I still think lucky him.
Yes, I think he did really well to get so close to Newton.
Yeah.
There are quite a few other people fairly close to Newton, but he, I think, did particularly well.
And then as we come up to this end of the church, these two famous western towers are actually Georgian. They're actually very late, aren't they?
Yes, we tend to think of the West Front as being an integral part of an overall Gothic design for the Abbey, but actually, of course, they're really the Gothic revival in the sense that they're constructed in the first part of the 18th century to complete the Abbey, which had remained incomplete. Poor old Henry III never got this far, as it were, but for many people they are the most iconic image of the Abbey, and of course it was famously caught in the Canaletto painting with the Knights of the Bath processing in front, painted very soon after the Order of the Bath had been created, and indeed very soon after the Western Towers had actually been constructed.
Now this is the other recent development, like royal weddings, this is a recent development, the tomb of the unknown soldier, warrior, which has given the Abbey a sort of huge importance and centrality right into the 20th century, as perhaps traditional faith has been on the decline.
It's a very extraordinary thought that what began, or what was seen as the royal mausoleum, as the place where the grandest people in the country were buried, it's now most famous for somebody being buried here who was a totally ordinary person whose name we don't know. That's to say, the unknown warrior. This was the idea of Dean Ryle, who was then the Abbey's dean. And in November 1920, there was the unveiling of the permanent cenotaph on the 11th of November, and then the body, the coffin of the unknown warrior was brought on a gun carriage from Whitehall to here and buried here. And it became a place of pilgrimage for millions of people who had themselves lost relatives during the First World War. And it's interesting that to this day it is the only tomb or place of burial or interment over which the public are not allowed to walk. You cannot tread on this, whereas there's lots of people we've been treading on as we've walked down here from the East End to the West End.
And you almost have to tread on the next one, which is...
Well, here we have a very interesting set of juxtapositions. Close by the unknown warrior who can't be trodden on is Winston Churchill, who actually can be trodden on. This was unveiled on the 25th anniversary of the Battle of Britain in September 1965, just a few months after Churchill died. And perhaps rather appropriately, within sight of the monument to Churchill is a monument to Franklin Roosevelt. I think I'm right in saying he's the only American president who is commemorated here. And that monument was unveiled shortly after the Second World War, shortly after Roosevelt's death, and both Churchill and Attlee actually turned up for the occasion. And Attlee is commemorated close by as well.
Churchill's right-hand man. Something appropriate about that.
I think there is. I think there is. And then here we have the recumbent effigy of Lord Salisbury, the last recumbent effigy put in the Abbey, and here is Lord Salisbury. Here are allusions to his Tudor ancestors. So you would expect him to be in here, but actually he's not in here at all. He's in Hatfield. But this was the last recumbent effigy put in the Abbey, just as the life-size statue of Gladstone was the last major statue put in the Abbey. And after that, the belief was that the Abbey was full up, and that if you were to commemorate other major figures in history, you have to think of doing it in a much less ostentatious and space-consuming way. So here we have this spectacular monument to Salisbury, though he's not here. Compare that with the much more stripped-down memorial stone to Churchill, and one sees the way in which modes of commemoration and celebration have changed from the early 20th century on through until the time we're in now. If we go back to the early 20th century, nobody, I think, would have foreseen the grandiosity of the imperial coronations of Edward VII and George V and George VI, and indeed the present Queen. They wouldn't, I think, have foreseen the growth of a much more secular society, a much more multiracial society. So that the way the Abbey's history unfolded across the 20th century was, I think, very different from how it was foreseen at the beginning of that century. And here we are now, if not at the beginning of the 21st century, then certainly nearer the beginning than the end. And my guess, my bet, my prediction, though I'm a historian so I don't really do the future, but my bet, my guess, my prediction would be that the Abbey's history will continue to unfold across the 21st century in ways that at the moment we cannot possibly foresee. But your successor and mine, having this conversation in 100 years' time, will probably look back on the 21st century as a time of extraordinary change and evolution for the Abbey, a change and evolution that at the moment you and I can't know about.
Hi folks, I'm Dan Snow. I'm on a History Hit TV adventure in Antarctica. You should subscribe because we've got a lot more of this kind of thing coming up, including digs on the former battlefields of the Western Front. As subscribers, you can use the code YouTube to get 50% off your first 3 months.